Thank you very much for very clear and implementable suggestion. This is very important. Are there any questions? Please.
To come back to your remarks on methane, I think methane is probably the best suited molecule to target for short-term climate forcing reduction. But you also mentioned it in view of health impacts perhaps being underestimated. Now, if methane increases, then that will have an effect on background ozone, but not so much on peak ozone. Now, since the health impacts are being related to peak ozone, although this is a bit controversial, methane may not have a big, may not be a big lever there. But maybe you can advise in how to deal with this, because actually we don't really know whether to address peak methane or peak ozone or background ozone.
Well, that's an important point. The new article that I referred you to does actually talk about the importance of background ozone. So it may well be that background ozone has been underestimated. The importance of background ozone has been underestimated. We also know that ozone affects human health perhaps indirectly through crops, for example. We've been doing some work on multiple environmental exposures of crops, fruit and vegetables, for example, and it's clear that ozone has negative effect not just on staple crops, but also on fruit and vegetables. So it will have indirect effects that would never, to my knowledge, ever been estimated properly. So I think this is something we need to look at holistically, and I hope you'll be involved in that kind of work.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Foreman.
Thank you. I really appreciated your emphasis on designing sustainable cities, and I just wanted to raise one potential pitfall that we're seeing, a tension between redevelopment and the problems of gentrification in the city. I really liked your emphasis on retrofit. Developers have convinced many cities that the only way to actually achieve walkable, sustainable cities is to clear things out, which obviously destroys local economies and so forth. So to think about that tension, I think, is an important element here.
Yeah, I mean, I accept that in many cities things are maybe going in the wrong direction, including in London, for example. We are having increasing inequalities in housing and so on. But at the same time, I think we need to have this vision in front of us that there could be a much better life. And of course, although populations around the world are increasing, about 300 cities around the world are shrinking. And in those cities, we actually have an opportunity to make much better use of green space, for example, to mobilize space for urban farming, for community activities, cities like Detroit, for example. So there are major opportunities in shrinking cities, which we shouldn't neglect, as well as potential opportunities for retrofitting cities which may be expanding beyond their original limits, and to look at innovative ways of housing people at a very high density, but making sure they also have access to green space.
Sir Andy Haines, I want to thank you very much for a very clear, a very concise presentation, non-academic, so I appreciate that very much. The more I hear about folks, I think my IQ level has dropped a few points for my lack of understanding of some of the graphs on the PowerPoint presentations. But I do want to thank you for your recognition of energy efficiency, because often it is the low-hanging fruit and is not as perhaps viewed as exciting as renewable energy, whether it's wind, solar, geothermal. It's a low-hanging fruit because obviously we're talking about retrofitting a building, a house, public or private, whether it's HVAC system insulation, whether it's double pane window fenestration, whether it's sensor lighting, which is very critical in terms of reducing our energy load, obviously, and paying less out of your pocket to energize your house, whether for heat or for air. So, which is really critical, dealing with energy efficiency. I very much like your emphasis on parks, open space, obviously for the issue of sequestration of either methane or carbon dioxide, but at the same time, quality of life issues, which is really critical. Oftentimes, in the United States, we make certain strategic decisions based on purchasing pristine, beautiful land, which is 2, 3, 4 hours outside of an urban dwelling, where those who only have the financial wherewithal can access Mother Nature, as opposed to those who actually need access to green space and open space don't have the financial wherewithal. So doing so in urban, more dense dwellings is absolutely critical, and I really appreciate that. Lastly, the point I want to make is what Dr. Foreman just mentioned with regards to urbanization, much more density, and the unintended consequences, if you will, of displacement or gentrification. When you move these types of policies, what is critical also too is moving policies with real intentionality that has a very real impact in improving the human condition for those who are the most vulnerable financially. Obviously, these are the individuals who are most exposed and are less resilient to carbon dioxide as well as other criteria pollutants, short-lived climate pollutants, black carbon, methane, et cetera, NOx, SOx, particulate matter 2.5. So in our quest, which I agree with 100%, to, and the illustration between Barcelona and Atlanta, Georgia, is brilliant, by the way. Same population, but your footprint geographically is 4, 5, 10 times larger than that, and how we can be more efficient in terms of planning, our cities. But we have to also take into account the unintended consequences of gentrification and displacement, and how we have to move policies that allow for affordability and accessibility for those. We see London, and we see other areas, San Francisco, parts of Los Angeles right now, where there's a very strong gentrification, displacement movement that are pushing the poor further out of the inner core, and hence, when they have to commute for the lack of public transportation, their carbon footprint is increased dramatically, and their quality of life has decreased as well, because they were pushed out of the urban core. So, but nonetheless, I would just want to say a very, very efficient and excellent presentation.
Very much, Andy, for wonderful presentation, which reinforced the idea that we have been discussing this morning. There are solutions. I mean, the situation is dramatic, but there are very concrete solutions. And in that sense, my question to you is whether, since the most of the action will be taken by city leaders, I mean, mayors or local governance, whether we are providing enough information to them and interventions, and maybe as well to highlight the idea of this group having a look at the Breathe Life campaign that we are putting together, WHO with UNEP, where you have a catalog of intervention for mayors, and we would like you to be agents of change and maybe passing that to your city. I already convinced senators to maybe consider that, and joining the movement, because at the city level, most of the action is where it will be taken. Lack of sensitivity on using Barcelona as an example, Andy.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I have to find another Spanish city, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're probably not providing the evidence that many urban decision makers need. I think the Great Breathe Life campaign is great, but I also think we need more integrated strategies. So this is around air quality, which is really good. But let's think about integrated strategies that combine resilience together with mitigation, together with air pollution reduction. And I think that would ultimately be more attractive to urban level decision makers. In order to do that, we need to generate better evidence. The Wellcome Trust is funding some work in this area. But I think we need to scale up our collaboration with mayors, particularly those who signed up to the Covenant of the Mayors, 7,500 of them. And if there's some way of kind of building a much better decision support, working together with them, the public health research community and practitioners, that would be, I think, a tremendous step forward.
Is the President Pombra?
I want to follow up on the concept of circular economy. I very much appreciate that you introduced the concept with the figure which you had, and also qualified it. Circularity is not per se sustainable. A circular economy, and I would like to have your reaction maybe to that comment, will only be sustainable if it has lots of biological processes in it, if it essentially is an element of a bioeconomy, a more biologized industry with biology-driven industrial processes. And in that sense, I see it sort of integrated as a concept between bioeconomy and circular economy. And it would bring us also closer to the concept of back to nature and back to sunshine, which colleague Lee has introduced eloquently earlier. I make this point because I see around the European Commission a debate of one versus the other, and I think that is not healthy.
No, I agree with your concerns, because I think the discussion around the circular economy could go in a number of different directions, and I'm also concerned that the research community may not be enough embedded in some of these discussions, and I know the public health community has not really grasped the nature of the circular economy. We had a workshop, WHO European region held a workshop in health and the circular economy quite recently, which as far as I know is the first kind of event of its kind. So these are important steps. The bioeconomy, I think, is part, or could be, part of the circular economy if it's properly managed. What we need to guard against is trade-offs. There are maybe trade-offs between the exploitation of land, for example, we've seen this with biofuels, badly designed biofuel policies. So we need well-designed bioeconomy policies which don't undermine kind of food systems. I'm sure that can be done, but I think it needs to be built in from the outset. I also think we need to distinguish, as I said, between the high throughput circular economy and a lower throughput circular economy, which will be much easier to control in terms of its environmental footprint, based a lot on sharing principles, for example. We don't all need to possess a car. We don't all need to have everything. We can use those services when we need them. So I think it seems to me that there are different approaches towards the circular economy, and I hope that the scientific community can get more engaged in some of these debates before they get too far down the road and they get dominated by very special interests who may have their own particular interpretation of what the circular economy is and should be.
Thank you, Dr. Fromkin.
Andy, thanks for a great presentation, as always. I want to go back to the question of urban design that occasioned a few questions just a few minutes ago and add a layer of complexity and ask you to reflect on it. Jeff Sachs pointed out the essential nature of long-range planning. And John Schellenhuber mentioned the possibility of large refugee dislocations with time. Put those together, and here's where you end up. There is a non-zero chance that some large cities will have to decant much of their population later in this century. In the U.S., Miami, New Orleans, some of the Gulf cities in Texas, Los Angeles may become uninhabitable. There may be massive failures of adaptation. If that happens, then we may have large population shifts, and there will be receiving cities. Detroit may be one, Seattle, where I live, may be one. I can tell you that there isn't a single city planner who is contemplating population growth beyond standard projections, the sudden influx of several 100,000 people. What are your thoughts about urban design for sustainable, resilient cities in a setting where we may see sudden peaks or sudden infusions of population? How do we handle that?
Well, Howie, I think without some foresight and planning, it will be extremely difficult. It can't be left to the market forces, that is for absolute sure. So we need some kind of, we need more vulnerability assessments. We need to know where those kind of cities are to plan for unexpected. And one of the problems is that there may be low probability but very catastrophic events. So the question is, what weight do we put on those low probability but catastrophic events compared with the higher probability but lower impact events? And I guess I would argue that where possible, we ought to take both into account. I think one strategy that might be used is the use of prefabricated buildings. We used to think of prefabricated buildings as being the cheap end and the nasty end of the market, but modern prefabrication can really develop very high quality buildings. Very low energy use, very efficient manufacture. You can roll them out quickly. They're good employment. Yep. They're good employers. So maybe we need to think about ways in which we scale up housing and other facilities very quickly through prefabrication. And I think prefabrication myself will become more and more dominant in terms of routine housing. So if you want to buy a house, you're going to buy it probably out of a catalog, and someone's going to deliver it to your house. In fact, as I was coming here, I noticed an advert for loft extensions. So instead of having a builder that's going to build your loft. You just order it, and it arrives, and they just jack it up on the roof and take the roof off and drop it down. So, hey, so maybe there are solutions that we haven't thought about that we could go with.
Well, because of the interest of time, we'll take two final questions. One is by Dr. Kamen and then Dr. Peters. Maybe two questions first, and then you give the answer.
Andy, thanks for that great run-through. Let me just do really quickly and then more general than I might have done. And that is that in many of the projects we look at, we see that the per dollar or per investment into environmental justice, that the impacts on a social but also a climate side are actually far higher than many of the other projects, notably for solar for more wealthy citizens, et cetera. Can you comment on how much you see that in terms of the public health perspective, and B, if you think it's true, do you think there's enough of a opportunity to sort of really to push environmental justice to the front? And so, Senator De Leon and others in California have really pushed hard to make sure that our next climate bill, which is already passed in law, not Assembly Bill 32 to 2020, but Senate Bill 32 that goes to 2030, requires that a significant fraction of the funds be spent on environmental injustices as a core part of the climate law.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, I think environmental justice is a very appealing concept to many of us in this room, but I think we have to acknowledge that there are also some decision makers for whom it wouldn't be so appealing. So I guess it's always a question of who you're talking to and what argument you're going to use to convince them. For some, we should use the argument of environmental justice. For others, we might use the argument that it would provide employment, it would deal with local pressing issues. I think it's really important with decision makers to understand what decisions they have to make soon, what their priorities are, and then how you can influence their priorities in the direction you want to go. So if you just go to project your own particular preoccupations, that's often not so successful. But if you understand what their agenda is and where your agenda intersects with theirs, then I think it can really work.
If I could just do a 1 second follow on. What I tried to say in the beginning of that, but maybe wasn't clear on, as I said, if you look at the marginal cost and marginal benefit, so I wasn't trying to say just do it because we love EJ, but specifically because we see that for health and for energy, for transportation investments, it actually looks like the I hate to say lowest hanging fruit because that's not the implication. This is the best investment for many of those dollars, yuan, yen, euro, whatever.
Yeah, I think that's generally correct. And the reason for that, of course, is that low-income people tend to be more vulnerable. They tend to suffer more ill health. So interventions directed at them will often be, much more cost-effective. And they tend to be marginalized by market-based solutions. So yeah, for all those reasons, I think you're absolutely correct.
Just a comment, you had mentioned, I appreciate your comment about urban design. That expertise will not develop within cities. And if it does, it will be variable. So you asked how you could help. I think organizations like yours and your networks could provide the kind of support on relocation, something like that, or retrofitting transportation. That would be very helpful, both for those cities that are earnestly trying to make the changes, but also for some politicians who might be saying that they want to do it and maybe aren't willing to make those tough choices. That would give the people who want to force those changes some ammunition. I don't think it will come from inside cities, so I think we'll be relying on you and your networks to help with that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think there's a lot of interest in it in the urban planning community, and I know that urban planning is not fashionable in all cities, but I think there is still an urban planning, urban design community out there. A lot of architects are interested in this. I was just at a conference on healthy urban design in which these kind of issues really were kind of absolutely forefront. So there's quite a big appetite out there in that community to work with public health and sustainability. I think one of the issues is that we as researchers are often not incentivized to do that. So, we don't provide what you need is almost a kind of consultancy service, which, a decision maker comes to us and says, I've got these different options. Tell me what each one of them would do in terms of health, the environment, the local economy. And we're not geared up to provide that kind of service. And I think there's a need for a kind of new type of professional who is a kind of intermediary between the research community and the decision makers and can provide research-based, evidence-informed information and decision support tools that would allow decision makers to make better decisions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Haines.